In the summer of 1798, beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, the fate of empires hung in the balance on the azure waters of the Mediterranean. Napoleon Bonaparte, the rising star of revolutionary France, had assembled one of the most ambitious expeditions in history. 38,000 soldiers, scholars, and dreamers sailed eastward with visions of conquering Egypt and striking at the very heart of British power in India. Yet pursuing them through the shimmering heat haze was a British fleet commanded by a one-eyed admiral whose name would soon echo through the annals of naval warfare. Horatio Nelson was not content with mere victory. He sought nothing less than the complete annihilation of his enemies. What unfolded in the waters of Aboukir Bay would shatter French naval power for generations and trap Napoleon's army on foreign shores with no hope of escape. The story begins not with the thunder of cannons, but with the whispered ambitions of a young general whose hunger for glory knew no bounds. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the deck of his flagship, gazing eastward toward the land of the pharaohs. Behind him stretched a fleet so vast that witnesses claimed it darkened the horizon. 180 ships carried the dreams of the French Republic toward Egypt, their holds packed with soldiers, scientists, and supplies for what Napoleon envisioned as the first step toward a new empire that would stretch from the Nile to the Ganges. The scale of preparation had been breathtaking. For months, the ports of southern France buzzed with activity as Bonaparte assembled his expeditionary force. 38,000 men gathered in Mediterranean harbors, their ranks swelled by an unprecedented collection of scholars, artists, and engineers. The Commission des Sciences et des Arts, as Napoleon called them, represented the finest minds of France. These were not mere conquerors, but the architects of a new civilization that would rise in the shadow of the pyramids. Yet even as the French expedition took shape, Napoleon enforced absolute secrecy about its destination. His own officers remained in the dark, speculating wildly about their target. Some whispered of Ireland, others of Sicily or Naples. The truth was far more audacious. Egypt represented the master key to British prosperity, the vital link in the chain that connected London to the riches of India. By seizing Egypt, Napoleon believed he could force Britain to its knees and reshape the balance of power across the globe. The French Directory had their own reasons for blessing this distant adventure. While Napoleon's strategic vision was undeniably brilliant, there were those in Paris who viewed the politically ambitious general and his fiercely loyal veterans with growing unease. Sending Bonaparte and his most devoted followers as far from France as possible served multiple purposes. If the expedition succeeded, France would gain an empire. If it failed, potential rivals would be conveniently eliminated. On the 19th of May, 1798, the Great Armada finally departed from Toulon. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. Warships and transports stretched across the Mediterranean like a floating city, their sails billowing in the warm breeze. At their heart sailed the Orient, Admiral François-Paul Brueys' massive flagship, mounting 120 guns and serving as the floating palace of French naval might. But even as the French fleet celebrated its departure, danger stalked them across the wine-dark sea. In the harbors of Britain, another fleet was stirring. Admiral John Jervis, commander of the Mediterranean squadron, had received intelligence of French preparations, and he dispatched his most aggressive and innovative captain to investigate. Horatio Nelson, the victor of Cape St. Vincent, was a commander unlike any other in the Royal Navy. Where his peers sought orderly battle and honorable defeat of the enemy, Nelson harbored darker ambitions. He had learned from his mentor Jervis that the goal was not merely to defeat the French, but to annihilate them utterly. Nelson's pursuit began almost immediately, yet it would prove to be one of the most frustrating chases in naval history. Time and again, the British admiral came tantalizingly close to his quarry, missing them by mere hours. The Mediterranean became a vast game board where two master tacticians maneuvered their forces, each seeking the decisive advantage that would determine the fate of nations. The French expedition's first triumph came at Malta, where Napoleon's forces seized the ancient stronghold of the Knights of Street. John, in a matter of days. The proud knights, who had once held the island against the full might of the Ottoman Empire, crumbled before French efficiency and revolutionary fervor. Napoleon installed a garrison in Valletta and pressed onward toward his ultimate prize. Meanwhile, Nelson's frustration mounted with each passing day. His flagship vanguard had been dismasted in a violent storm, scattering his frigate screen and leaving him partially blind to enemy movements. Reinforcements arrived from Admiral St. Vincent, bringing his strength to 14 ships of the line. But without adequate scouting vessels, Nelson remained at a severe disadvantage. He searched the eastern Mediterranean like a bloodhound following a cold trail, visiting empty harbors and questioning merchant captains for any hint of French whereabouts. The psychological pressure was immense. Nelson understood that his reputation, carefully built over years of daring actions, hung in the balance. At home in England, critics whispered that an opportunity had been missed to fight another Trafalgar 7 years early, potentially capturing Napoleon himself and saving Britain a mountain of future troubles. The weight of expectation pressed down on the one-eyed admiral as he scoured the seas for his elusive prey. Unknown to Nelson, the French had successfully landed their army in Egypt on the 1st of July. The ancient port of Alexandria, once the jewel of the Ptolemaic kingdom, witnessed the arrival of French soldiers on its sandy shores. Napoleon's proclamation to his men rang with revolutionary fervor and Orientalist dreams. They had come not as mere conquerors, but as liberators, freeing Egypt from the feudal oppression of Mamluk rule and bringing the enlightenment of French civilization to the land of the Nile. Admiral Brueys faced a critical decision. With the army safely ashore, should he sail his fleet to safety or remain to provide support? Alexandria's harbor proved inadequate for his massive ships, forcing him to seek anchorage elsewhere. The admiral called his captains aboard the Orient to debate their options. Napoleon had suggested that if local conditions proved too dangerous, the fleet could sail north to Corfu, leaving only transports and lighter vessels behind. But Brueys refused to abandon his post. He believed his squadron could provide essential artillery support to the French army and serve as a lifeline to France. Against the vocal protests of Contre-Amiral Armand Blanquet, who argued that the fleet would be more effective in open water, the majority of captains agreed to establish a defensive position in nearby Aboukir Bay. The bay seemed to offer natural advantages. 16 nautical miles across, it stretched from the village of Aboukir to the town of Rosetta, where one of the Nile's mouths emptied into the Mediterranean. Brueys arranged his 13 ships of the line in a compact formation, anchored in a north-south line with protection from Aboukir Island's batteries to the northwest and deadly shoals guarding the landward approach. The French admiral believed he had created an impregnable fortress, a steel wall that would shatter any British attack. Yet Brueys had made critical errors that would soon prove fatal. His crews were exhausted from months at sea and weakened by disease. Substantial numbers of sailors worked ashore, digging wells for fresh water rather than maintaining watch for enemy ships. The admiral had failed to establish proper reconnaissance, leaving his fleet blind to approaching danger. Most crucially, he had underestimated his opponent. On the 28th of July, Captain Troubridge of the British fleet obtained confirmation from a passing merchant vessel that the French had indeed sailed eastward. Nelson immediately set course for Egypt once more, his heart pounding with anticipation. On the 1st of August, 1798, his lookouts finally spotted what they had sought for so long. Alexandria Harbor, empty during Nelson's previous visit, now bristled with French transport vessels. The hunt was nearly over. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the French battle fleet, and with it, Nelson's appointment with immortality. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly as Nelson's ships approached the Egyptian coast. His captains crowded the quarterdeck of the Vanguard, telescopes trained on the distant shoreline where the ancient city of Alexandria shimmered in the heat. The sight that greeted them sent electricity coursing through British hearts. French transport vessels packed the harbor like sardines, their tricolor flags hanging limp in the stifling air. The army was ashore, but where was their guardian fleet? Nelson's keen tactical mind was already racing. If the transports were here, Brueys could not be far away. The French admiral would never abandon his army without protection, not when British warships prowled these waters like hungry wolves. Nelson ordered his fleet to sweep eastward along the coast, every man straining his eyes for the telltale forest of masts that would mark their quarry's position. As the British ships rounded the headland near Aboukir, the horizon suddenly erupted with enemy sails. There, anchored in the broad sweep of Aboukir Bay, lay the French battle fleet in all its terrible majesty. 13 ships of the line stretched across the water in perfect formation, their hulls dark against the golden afternoon light. At their center towered the Orient, Brueys' colossal flagship, her 3 decks bristling with cannon that could reduce any British ship to floating wreckage. The sight should have given Nelson pause. Conventional naval wisdom demanded caution when attacking an enemy in a prepared position, especially with darkness approaching. Most admirals would have withdrawn to study the French dispositions, plan a careful approach for the following dawn, and ensure every detail was perfect before risking battle. But Nelson was not most admirals. His mind worked with the speed of lightning, analyzing the French position and recognizing opportunities that lesser commanders would have missed. The enemy ships were anchored in line, their broadsides facing seaward to repel any frontal assault. But anchored ships had limitations. They could not maneuver, could not choose their angles of engagement, and most importantly, they had left a crucial vulnerability exposed. Nelson summoned his captains to the Vanguard's great cabin for rapid consultation. These were men who had sailed with him before, officers who understood his revolutionary approach to naval warfare. Captain Thomas Foley of the Goliath, Captain Samuel Hood of the Zealous, Captain James Saumarez of the Orion. Each was a master mariner in his own right, yet they deferred to Nelson's genius for reading the tactical possibilities that others could not see. The plan Nelson outlined was breathtaking in its audacity. Rather than attack the French line head-on, where superior numbers would tell against the British, he proposed to divide his fleet and strike the enemy from 2 directions simultaneously. Some ships would engage the French from seaward as expected, but others would perform a maneuver that would revolutionize naval warfare forever. Nelson had observed something crucial about the French anchorage. If there was room for each enemy ship to swing on its anchor with the tide, there must be room for a British ship to pass between the French line and the shore. By sailing around the head of the enemy formation, several British vessels could attack from the landward side, catching the French in a devastating crossfire. It was a move that required perfect seamanship, intimate knowledge of wind and tide, and nerves of steel. The slightest miscalculation would send British ships crashing onto the shoals that guarded the bay's inner waters. The sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Any other admiral would have waited for dawn, but Nelson understood that darkness could be an ally rather than an enemy. The French would not expect a night attack, and confusion in the darkness might work to British advantage. More importantly, Nelson had trained his crews to fight by touch and instinct, while the French sailors, weakened by months in tropical waters, would struggle to respond effectively in the chaos of nighttime battle. At 5:30 in the evening, with the British fleet bearing down on Aboukir Bay in line of battle, Nelson raised the signal that would echo through naval history. The flag spelling out "Engage the enemy more closely" snapped in the wind as British gun crews loaded their weapons and prepared for the fight of their lives. Admiral Brueys watched the approaching British ships with growing alarm. He had expected Nelson to probe the French defenses and withdraw, perhaps sending a single vessel to take soundings in the bay. The sight of the entire enemy fleet forming for immediate attack sent shockwaves through the French command. There were barely 45 minutes of daylight remaining. Surely no sane admiral would risk a night engagement in unfamiliar waters against a prepared enemy position. But as the British line drew closer, Brueys realized with dawning horror that Nelson was indeed committed to battle. Frantic signals flew from the Orient as French captains scrambled to recall their shore parties and prepare for action. Drums beat to quarters throughout the anchored fleet as sailors who had been relaxing in the late afternoon heat suddenly found themselves racing to man their guns. The French position should have been unassailable. Their ships were anchored in perfect order, forming an iron wall across the bay's entrance. Shore batteries on Aboukir Island commanded the northern approach, while treacherous shoals protected the southern flank. Any attacking force would have to approach directly into the teeth of French firepower, accepting terrible punishment before they could reply effectively. Yet as Nelson's fleet approached, the British admiral's tactical brilliance became apparent. The leading ships, Goliath and Zealous, did not steer for the expected frontal assault. Instead, they swept northward around the head of the French line, their deep-drafted hulls skimming dangerously close to the underwater hazards that lurked beneath Aboukir Bay's deceptively calm surface. Captain Foley and the Goliath led this daring maneuver, his ship's bow cutting through the evening swells as he navigated by instinct and years of experience. Behind him followed Zealous, Orion, Theseus, and Audacious, each captain trusting in Nelson's judgment and their own seamanship to avoid the fate that awaited any vessel unlucky enough to strike the hidden shoals. The psychological impact on the French was immediate and devastating. Brueys had planned for a conventional engagement, with British ships attacking his line from seaward, while his vessels replied with massed broadsides. Instead, he watched in growing dismay as enemy warships materialized on his unprotected landward flank, turning his carefully prepared defensive position into a death trap. As the sun touched the horizon and the first British ships opened fire, the Battle of the Nile erupted with a fury that would be remembered for centuries to come. The thunder that erupted across Aboukir Bay was unlike anything the world had witnessed. As Captain Foley's Goliath swept around the head of the French line, her 44 guns spoke in perfect unison, belching flame and iron into the unprepared landward side of the enemy formation. The French ship Guerrier, caught completely off guard by this unprecedented maneuver, shuddered under the devastating impact. Her mast splintered, her rigging collapsed in tangled ruin, and her crew fell in heaps around their guns. But this was only the beginning. As each British ship followed Goliath around the French van, they delivered their own crushing broadsides into the helpless enemy vessels. Zealous, Orion, Theseus, and Audacious formed a line of destruction that raked the French ships from bow to stern. Within 20 minutes of the first shot, the leading 3 French vessels had been reduced to floating wrecks, their guns silenced and their crews decimated. The horror of naval warfare in the age of sail revealed itself in all its brutal glory. Cannonballs weighing 24 pounds smashed through oak timbers 2 feet thick, sending deadly splinters flying like arrows through the confined spaces below deck. The concussion of each broadside shattered eardrums and left men stunned and bleeding. Grape shot swept across enemy decks like a scythe through wheat, cutting down anyone brave enough to remain exposed. Admiral Brueys, standing on the quarterdeck of his flagship Orient, watched his carefully laid plans dissolve into chaos. The British had achieved what every naval tactician would have declared impossible. They had doubled his line, placing French ships between 2 fires and concentrating overwhelming force against a portion of his fleet, while the rest could only watch helplessly from their anchored positions. Yet the French did not surrender to despair. These were veteran sailors who had fought the Royal Navy before, men hardened by years of revolutionary warfare and trained in the traditions of French naval excellence. As the British ships pressed their attack, French gun crews responded with their own devastating volleys. The confined waters of the bay echoed with the roar of hundreds of cannon as both fleets hammered each other at point-blank range. Nelson himself was not immune to the carnage unfolding around him. As his flagship Vanguard engaged the French ship Spartiate, enemy gunners targeted the British command structure with deadly precision. Captain Antoine-René Thévenard had used his anchor spring to angle his broadside across Vanguard's bow, a position that allowed his guns to rake the British flagship from stem to stern. The concentrated fire was devastating. Vanguard's casualties mounted rapidly as French shot tore through her hull and rigging. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, an iron splinter fired in a Langrage round struck Nelson above his blinded right eye. The impact was catastrophic. A flap of skin fell across his face, and blood poured down his features as the admiral collapsed into the arms of Captain Edward Berry. In that moment of crisis, Nelson believed his wound was mortal. The man who had faced countless battles without flinching suddenly found himself confronting his own mortality in the swirling darkness of a ship readout to those around him. "Remember me to's cockpit. I am killed. He see, my wife." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical injury. Nelson, temporarily blinded by blood and torn flesh, was certain that death had claimed him at the moment of his greatest triumph. The ship's surgeon, Michael Jefferson, worked frantically to assess the damage while the battle raged overhead. His examination revealed that despite the dramatic appearance of the wound, it was relatively superficial. The iron splinter had torn the scalp, but had not penetrated the skull itself. With careful stitching, Jefferson managed to close the gash and stop the bleeding, though Nelson's recovery would be neither quick nor comfortable. Even as their admiral lay wounded below deck, the British fleet continued its methodical destruction of French naval power. The doubling maneuver had achieved everything Nelson had hoped for and more. French ships found themselves caught in crossfires that no vessel could withstand for long. British gun crews, trained to a peak of efficiency through endless drills and combat experience, maintained a rate of fire that their enemies simply could not match. The French resistance, while brave, was ultimately doomed by the tactical situation Nelson had created. Ships like Conquerant and Spartiate, isolated at the head of the line and surrounded by British vessels, fought with desperate courage even as their hulls were shot through and their crews slaughtered. The confined waters of the bay, which Brueys had thought would protect his fleet, instead became a killing ground where damaged ships had no room to maneuver and retreat was impossible. As darkness fell completely over Aboukir Bay, the nature of the battle changed but did not diminish in intensity. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning, briefly illuminating scenes of destruction that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The smell of gunpowder mixed with blood and SP touch and instinct, loading and firing their earth. Men fought by lintered wood created an atmosphere of hell on guns in mechanical repetition while the world exploded around them. The psychological pressure on both fleets was immense. In daylight, sailors could at least see their enemies and understand the tactical situation. In darkness, every ship became an isolated fortress surrounded by unseen threats. The constant thunder of gunfire, the screams of wounded men, and the crash of falling masts created a cacophony that drove some sailors to madness. Yet it was in this hellish environment that the climax of the battle would unfold. At the center of the French line, Admiral Brueys' flagship Orient continued to fight even as destruction closed in around her. The massive three-decker was by far the largest vessel in the bay, mounting 120 guns and carrying over 1,000 men. If she could be destroyed, the heart would be torn out of French resistance. British ships began to concentrate their fire on the giant flagship. Alexander, Swiftsure, and other vessels maneuvered to bring their guns to bear on Orient's towering hull. The French crew fought back with desperate valor, their heavy cannon replying shot for shot, even as their ship began to show signs of serious damage. But the odds were overwhelming, and the outcome was only a matter of time. Deep within Orient's hull, a disaster was taking shape that would dwarf all the destruction that had come before. Somewhere in the chaos of battle, fire had taken hold. Whether from burning wadding that drifted from British guns, or from the careless handling of powder charges in the heat of combat, flames began to spread through the flagship's interior. At first, the fire was small and manageable, but in the confined spaces of a wooden warship packed with gunpowder and ammunition, even the smallest blaze could become an inferno. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by paint and oil that had been carelessly left exposed on the ship's upper decks. French sailors fought desperately to contain the flames even as they continued to man their guns. But the task was hopeless. The fire had reached the ready magazines where carcass ammunition was stored, explosive rounds designed to burn even in water. As the temperature rose and the flames spread, everyone in the bay knew what was coming. At 10 o'clock in the evening, as the Battle of the Nile reached its crescendo, the inevitable finally occurred. Orient exploded with a force that defied comprehension, a blast so powerful that it was heard 20 miles away and seen as a thin red arrow shooting up against the black horizon. The explosion tore through the night like the wrath of gods, its concussion so violent that it ripped open the seams of nearby ships and sent flaming debris raining down across the entire bay. For those closest to the blast, the world became a nightmare of fire and twisted metal. Sailors on surrounding vessels felt their eardrums burst, despite the protective cloth they had wrapped around their heads. The shockwave lifted men off their feet and hurled them against bulkheads with bone-crushing force. Burning wreckage from the Orient flew in all directions, much of it soaring clear over the surrounding ships to crash into the sea beyond. Flaming timbers and fragments of hull plating started fires on Swiftsure, Alexander, and Franklin, though quick-thinking crews with buckets of seawater managed to extinguish the blazes before they could take hold. The secondary explosion that followed on Franklin sent another shudder through the bay, a grim reminder of how close all these wooden ships sailed to complete destruction. The silence that followed was more terrible than any thunder of guns. For 10 minutes, no weapon fired in Aboukir Bay. Sailors from both nations stood stunned by the magnitude of destruction they had witnessed, while rescue boats pulled the few survivors from waters now choked with debris and bodies. Of Orient's 1,000-man crew, barely 70 would see another dawn. When the guns resumed their deadly chorus, the outcome was no longer in doubt. French resistance crumbled ship by ship as Nelson's revolutionary tactics completed their work of annihilation. By morning's light, 11 of 13 French ships of the line lay captured or destroyed. Only 2 vessels escaped into the dawn, carrying news of catastrophe back to Napoleon's stranded army. The Battle of the Nile had achieved what Nelson promised. French naval power in the Mediterranean was shattered beyond repair. Napoleon's dreams of Eastern Empire lay in ruins, his army trapped in Egypt, without hope of reinforcement or retreat. Britain's dominance of the seas was secured, and the Royal Navy's legend was written in smoke and flame across the waters of Aboukir Bay. In a single night, the course of history had been changed forever by one admiral's refusal to accept anything less than total victory.